The morning of September 12, 1999, arrived like every other Sunday in Willow Ridge, Pennsylvania. Sunlight angled through the maples lining Elmwood Drive, still green but hinting at autumn's edge, casting long shadows across front lawns still damp with dew. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and honeysuckle, the last breath of summer holding on against the coming cold. Birds called from the trees, their songs mixing with the distant hum of traffic from the highway a mile away. Inside the Patterson house, a modest two-story colonial with blue shutters and a white picket fence, 8-year-old Daniel Patterson sat at the kitchen table wearing his favorite red sneakers, the ones with the Velcro straps and the white stripes along the sides, slightly scuffed at the toes from weeks of playground games and backyard adventures. His mother, Linda, poured orange juice into his glass, the liquid catching the morning light as it streamed through the window above the sink, while his father, Robert, folded the newspaper and checked the wall clock. Church started in 40 minutes. Daniel swung his legs under the table, humming a tune from a cartoon he'd watched the night before, his heels tapping a rhythm against the chair legs. The red sneakers caught the morning light with each swing. No one in that kitchen knew those shoes would become a symbol of everything that vanished that day, a detail that would appear on missing person flyers for years to come, reproduced in black and white on bulletin boards from Pennsylvania to Ohio. By noon, the Pattersons' world had split open. Daniel had disappeared from the church parking lot during the social hour after service, somewhere between the fellowship hall, where coffee and cookies were being served on folding tables covered with plastic tablecloths, and the family's parked sedan in the third row. One moment he'd been visible near the potluck tables, reaching for a chocolate chip cookie while talking to another boy from his Sunday school class. The next, he was gone. Linda remembered scanning the crowd of families milling about in the late morning sunshine, expecting to see that red flash of sneakers among the children playing tag near the playground equipment at the lot's edge. Robert remembered the exact second panic replaced confusion when the pastor's wife, Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman in her 60s who taught the kindergarten class, approached with concern, creasing her face, and said she'd seen Daniel walking toward the far edge of the lot with someone, but couldn't recall who. The description was vague, frustratingly so. A woman, maybe middle-aged, wearing sunglasses and a blue cardigan. The Willow Ridge Police Department received the call at 12:47 p.m. Within the hour, officers cordoned off the parking area with yellow tape that fluttered in the breeze, interviewed witnesses still milling about in states of shock and concern, and began searching the immediate vicinity. By evening, as the sun sank low and shadows lengthened across the property, search teams combed the woods behind the church, flashlights cutting arcs through the thickening dark, volunteers calling Daniel's name into the silence that answered with nothing but wind through leaves. The first 72 hours unfolded in a chaos of motion and paralysis, a blur of activity that seemed both urgent and futile. Neighbors formed search grids, walking shoulder to shoulder through fields and along creek beds, checking abandoned buildings and drainage culverts, looking under bridges and behind dumpsters. Bloodhounds were brought in from the county sheriff's office on Monday morning. They picked up Daniel's scent near the church entrance, but lost it at the road, a detail that pointed toward a vehicle, toward intentionality, toward the possibility that this wasn't a child who'd wandered off, but one who'd been taken. The local television station, WPGH Channel 7, ran Daniel's school photo on the evening news. A boy with brown hair parted to the side, a gap-toothed smile that lit up his whole face, freckles scattered across his nose, wearing a striped shirt in red and white. Linda and Robert sat through police interviews that felt both endless and too short, answering questions about routines, acquaintances, anyone who might have shown unusual interest in their son. Detective Sarah Mills, a veteran investigator with the Willow Ridge PD, led the questioning. They mentioned a neighbor who'd moved away months earlier, a man who'd sometimes lingered too long when Daniel played in the yard, watching from his porch with a beer in hand. They mentioned a church volunteer who'd since relocated to another state, a woman whose enthusiasm around children had occasionally struck Linda as intense, almost desperate. Detectives followed both leads with urgency. Neither went anywhere. The neighbor had a solid alibi, confirmed by his new employer 2 states away, and security footage showing him at work the day Daniel disappeared. The volunteer had moved to Ohio to care for an aging parent and hadn't been in Pennsylvania for 6 months, a fact verified by medical records and utility bills. If you're watching this story unfold and you've ever felt the weight of uncertainty, or if you're drawn to cases where hope refuses to die even when logic says it should, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. These stories matter because they remind us that resolution, when it finally comes, can look nothing like we imagined. By the end of the first week, flyers papered every storefront in Willow Ridge and 3 neighboring towns. Daniel's face appeared on bulletin boards, taped to gas station windows, pinned to community center corkboards, hung in the front windows of restaurants and hardware stores, displayed at post offices and libraries. The image showed his round face, his easy smile, and underneath in bold letters, "Missing since September 12th, 1999. Last seen wearing a blue polo shirt, khaki shorts, and red Velcro sneakers." A description of his height, 4 feet 2 inches, his weight, 60 pounds. Distinguishing marks including a small scar on his left knee from a bicycle accident the previous summer. A phone number to call with information. The Pattersons set up a tip line with the help of a local missing children's organization that had been founded by another family whose child had vanished years earlier. Calls trickled in throughout September, a sighting 2 counties over that turned out to be a different child whose parents were understandably upset by the accusation. A report of a boy matching Daniel's description seen at a rest stop in Pennsylvania, getting into a van with out-of-state plates. Robert drove 7 hours through the night to follow that lead. His hands gripping the steering wheel so hard, his fingers went numb, his mind racing through scenarios of rescue and reunion. It dissolved when the family in question produced their son's birth certificate and expressed bewilderment at being approached. Robert drove home in silence, the empty passenger seat beside him, a constant reminder of what he'd hoped to find. Autumn gave way to winter, the leaves falling and the temperatures dropping, frost appearing on windows in the morning. The search radius expanded, then contracted as resources thinned and other cases demanded attention. Volunteers who'd walked the woods every weekend, who'd posted flyers and organized candlelight vigils at the church, returned to their own lives. The initial surge of community support, meals dropped off at the Patterson house in foil-covered casserole dishes, offers to mow the lawn, watch the dog, help with errands, gradually tapered. Not from lack of caring, but from the simple erosion of sustained crisis, the way extraordinary circumstances eventually yield to ordinary routines. The Pattersons' home became a strange museum of interruption. Daniel's bedroom untouched, his school backpack still hanging on the hook by the door where he'd left it that Saturday before church, his math homework half finished on the desk, his handwriting looping across the page. A library book 2 weeks overdue, sitting on his nightstand, a bookmark shaped like a dinosaur marking his place on page 43. Linda developed a habit of setting the table for 3, laying out plates and silverware in their usual places, then removing the 3rd plate before Robert came home from work, unable to bear the sight of the empty chair. Robert started driving past the church on his way to and from his job at the hardware supply warehouse, as though proximity to the site might unlock some overlooked detail, some missed clue that would bring Daniel home. Holidays arrived like sentencing. Thanksgiving passed in numb silence, the turkey left in the freezer, the table bare. Christmas came with decorations that stayed boxed in the attic, the tree undecorated, the lights unstrung. Daniel's 9th birthday in March. They lit a candle. They did not sing. They sat in the living room holding hands and crying. The case attracted the attention of the FBI's Child Abduction and Serial Murder Investigative Resources Center in Quantico, Virginia. An agent named Patricia Hollis, a 20-year veteran specializing in child abduction cases, reviewed the file in early 2000 and noted that the lack of physical evidence and the public setting of the disappearance suggested either an opportunistic stranger abduction or someone with enough familiarity to exploit a moment of distraction without raising immediate alarm. She recommended adding Daniel's profile to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database, a registry that allowed cross-referencing with unidentified children found across state lines, and initiating age progression imaging once he'd been missing for 2 years, a standard protocol that helped families and law enforcement visualize what a missing child might look like as they aged. Meanwhile, detectives conducted a second wave of interviews, this time focusing on registered offenders within a 50-mile radius. 3 individuals were brought in for questioning. All had alibis that checked out. One had been at work at a factory across town, time stamped by security footage showing him clocking in and out. Another had been hospitalized following a car accident the day before Daniel disappeared. The third had been out of state, confirmed by hotel records and credit card receipts. The case file thickened with dead ends, false leads, and witness statements that contradicted one another in small but significant ways. One person said they saw Daniel leave with a woman in a blue car. Another said it was a grey truck. A third insisted they saw him walking toward the woods alone. By the time 2000 turned into 2001, the calendar flipping to a new year that brought no new answers, the Pattersons had learned to navigate a life built on absence. Linda returned to her job as a school librarian at Willow Ridge Elementary in January. Though colleagues noticed, she flinched whenever a child Daniel's age walked past the front desk, whenever she heard a boy's laughter that sounded too much like his. She threw herself into work, reorganizing the entire fiction section by author and genre, creating new reading programs for struggling students, anything to fill the hours and quiet the thoughts. Robert took on extra shifts at the warehouse, working nights and weekends, less for the money than for the distraction, for the physical exhaustion that allowed him to sleep a few hours each night without dreaming. They joined a support group for families of missing children, meeting once a month in the basement of a community center 2 towns over. There, in a circle of folding chairs under fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered, they encountered others who spoke the same language of stalled investigations and unresolved grief. One father, whose daughter had vanished from a shopping mall 5 years earlier, described it as living in a question mark. Another mother, whose son had disappeared from a birthday party, said it felt like being underwater, watching the surface but never breaking through. They shared strategies for survival, how to handle well-meaning strangers who asked if they had children, how to navigate anniversaries and birthdays, how to balance hope with the need to function in daily life, how to stay married when grief pulled in opposite directions. The procedural machinery kept grinding, slowly but steadily. Every 6 months, a detective from the Willow Ridge PD would call to update the Pattersons, usually to say there was nothing new to report, but that the case remained open, that Daniel's information was still circulating through law enforcement channels, that they hadn't forgotten. In 2003, the department received funding through a federal grant to digitize old case files, and Daniel's folder was among the first converted, his information now searchable in databases that connected police departments across the country. In 2005, the age progression image was updated. Daniel at 16, his features matured by software algorithms that predicted the angles of adolescence based on his parents' bone structure and his own childhood features. The child's roundness was replaced by a teenager's sharper jaw, longer face, darker eyebrows, the suggestion of stubble. The image circulated on early internet missing persons forums, was shared on a handful of television specials dedicated to cold cases, appeared on the National Centre's website alongside thousands of other missing children, each face a story of loss and uncertainty. Tips came in sporadically, each one a flare of hope that dimmed within days. A teenager in Ohio who resembled the image but turned out to be a local kid whose identity was easily verified through school records. A sighting in Florida that went nowhere, the witness unable to provide any concrete details. A call from someone claiming to have information who then demanded money and was dismissed as a fraud attempting to exploit grief. Then, for years, near silence. The investigation never officially closed, but it receded into the background hum of unsolved files, one of hundreds of cases that remained open in name only. Detectives retired, taking their institutional knowledge with them, their memories of the first frantic days and the leads that had seemed promising. New officers took over, inheriting case files they read through once and then set aside to focus on active investigations that demanded immediate attention. The original case file became a reference point for training exercises at the police academy. How to coordinate multi-agency searches, how to handle media during the critical first week, what mistakes to avoid when interviewing witnesses, how to balance family liaison with investigative objectivity. Daniel Patterson became a name in a database, a school photo on a poster that had long since faded in the sun on bulletin boards across 3 counties. Linda and Robert aged into a different kind of vigilance. They renewed Daniel's missing person entry every year, a ritual that required filling out the same forms, confirming their contact information, updating any details that might be relevant, though there were rarely any changes to report. They kept a small box of his belongings in the hall closet, his red sneakers, now impossibly small, a stuffed bear he'd slept with every night until he was 6, a drawing he'd made of their dog, Copper, in crayon on construction paper, the colors bright and cheerful. They never spoke about moving, though friends occasionally suggested a fresh start elsewhere, a new town where they wouldn't be known as the parents whose son disappeared. What if he comes back and we're not here? Linda once said when a co-worker broached the subject, and that was the end of that conversation. They stayed, they waited, they lived, they went to work, paid bills, maintained the house, attended obligatory social functions, all while carrying the weight of not knowing. In 2018, a small shift occurred in the landscape of cold case investigations. Advances in DNA technology and the proliferation of genetic genealogy databases began generating new leads in cases that had sat dormant for decades. Law enforcement agencies across the country started revisiting files, cross-referencing unidentified remains and unknown individuals against familial DNA uploaded to consumer ancestry sites. It was the same technology that had recently identified the Golden State Killer, breaking open a case that had gone cold for 40 years through a distant familial match that led investigators to the right suspect. The Willow Ridge Police Department, now operating with a more robust cold case unit thanks to a state grant focused on resolving long-term missing person cases, sent Daniel's case file to a regional task force that specialized in leveraging these new tools. Detective Mark Coburn, who joined the department in 2015 after a career in the military police, took a particular interest in the Patterson case. He was 38, methodical, known for his patience with old cases and his refusal to give up on leads others dismissed. He reviewed the original witness statements, re-interviewed the few people still living in the area who'd been present the day Daniel vanished, and uploaded the Pattersons' DNA profiles to a law enforcement database used to match missing persons with unidentified individuals found in morgues, hospitals, and foster systems across the country. Nothing came back immediately. The database worked through algorithms, comparing genetic markers across millions of profiles, flagging potential familial connections based on shared DNA segments that indicated biological relationships. It was slow, methodical, and often inconclusive, throwing up false positives that had to be manually investigated and ruled out through additional testing. But in early 2024, a match pinged in the system. Not a direct hit, a partial familial match, the kind that indicated a distant relative, a cousin or second cousin, sharing enough DNA to suggest a connection, but not an identity. The profile in question belonged to a man named Marcus Lane, who'd submitted his DNA to a consumer ancestry site in 2022, curious about his heritage after a conversation with a co-worker about genealogy and family trees. His genetic information had been cross-referenced through a third-party database that cooperated with law enforcement under specific legal parameters outlined in their terms of service, a practice that had become more common in recent years, despite ongoing debates about privacy. Detective Coburn reached out to Marcus Lane in March 2024, leaving a voicemail first and then following up with an email explaining that he was investigating a cold case and that Marcus's DNA had come up as a potential familial match. The man was 33, living in Ashford, a mid-sized city about 200 miles east of Willow Ridge, working in IT support for a regional hospital network. He agreed to a phone interview, puzzled but cooperative, his voice uncertain as he answered Coburn's questions. Yes, he'd taken a DNA test through one of those ancestry websites, more out of curiosity than any real expectation of finding anything interesting. No, he didn't know anyone named Patterson. He'd been raised by his parents, Sandra and Tom Lane, in Ashford his whole life, attending local schools, graduating from Ashford High in 2009, living in the same house on Maple Street until he'd moved out at 25. Or so he'd thought. When Coburn asked if Marcus had ever had reason to believe he was adopted, or if there were any gaps in his early childhood documentation, Marcus paused, the silence stretching long enough that Coburn thought the call might have dropped. Then he mentioned something odd. His birth certificate had always seemed slightly off. The county and date matched what his parents told him, born in Ashford on July 15, 1991. But years ago, when he'd applied for a passport to travel to Canada with friends, a clerk had noted some inconsistency in the filing, something about the formatting or the registration number not matching the standard conventions for that year. His parents had brushed it off, said it was a clerical error from when records were being digitized in the 90s, nothing to worry about, just bureaucratic incompetence. Marcus had accepted the explanation and moved on, though the comment had nagged at him occasionally in the years since. Coburn requested a meeting in person. Marcus agreed, though a knot of unease had begun tightening in his chest, a sense that something fundamental was about to shift. They met at a coffee shop in Ashford on a cold afternoon in late March 2024, rain streaking the windows and drumming on the roof. Coburn brought a folder. No dramatics, no accusations, just questions and documents. He showed Marcus the age progression image of Daniel Patterson at 33, a face digitally aged from an 8-year-old school photo. Marcus stared at the image on the laminated sheet, his coffee cooling in his hands. There was a resemblance, he admitted, the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, but resemblances were common. People looked like other people all the time. Coburn explained the partial DNA match, the possibility that Marcus might be connected to a missing person case from 1999, that there was reason to believe he might actually be Daniel Patterson. He asked if Marcus would consent to a direct comparison using a fresh DNA sample, a buccal swab that would provide a definitive answer, remove all doubt. Marcus agreed, his hand shaking slightly. The swab took 30 seconds, a Q-tip rubbed against the inside of his cheek, sealed in a sterile tube, labeled with case numbers and dates, and sent to the state forensic lab with a rush order. 6 weeks later, in early May, the lab results arrived. Definitive match. 99.9% probability. Marcus Lane was Daniel Patterson. The news shattered every certainty Marcus had built his life on. He sat in his apartment on a Thursday evening, staring at the email from Detective Coburn. Unable to process the words on the screen, he read them again, and again, and again, as though repetition might change the meaning. He was not Marcus Lane, or rather, Marcus Lane was a name stitched onto someone else's history, a false identity constructed by people he'd called Mom and Dad for 33 years. He was Daniel Patterson, abducted at age 8 from a church parking lot in Willow Ridge, Pennsylvania, missing for 25 years, presumed dead by some, forgotten by most. The parents who'd raised him, Sandra and Tom Lane, the people who'd attended his school plays and helped with homework and taught him to drive, were not his parents. They were his kidnappers. The investigation accelerated with the confirmation. Detectives brought Sandra and Tom Lane in for questioning, arriving at their modest ranch house on Maple Street early on a Tuesday morning in mid-May. Both were in their late 60s now, retired, living quietly on Social Security and modest savings. Under interrogation, in separate rooms at the Ashford Police Department, Sandra broke first, the weight of decades of secrecy finally too much to bear. She confessed to taking Daniel from the church parking lot in September 1999, the words tumbling out between sobs. She and Tom had been living in Willow Ridge at the time, renting a small house on the south side of town, attending the same church as the Pattersons, sitting just a few rows behind them each Sunday, close enough to hear Daniel's whispered questions during the sermon. Sandra had suffered multiple miscarriages over the years, each one a fresh wound, and a failed adoption process that left her devastated, her applications rejected due to Tom's inconsistent employment history and a minor criminal record from his 20s, a DUI, charges that had since been expunged but had appeared on background checks at the time. She'd watched Daniel week after week, smiling and bright, full of life and possibility, everything she couldn't have, and something inside her had bent and then snapped. On that Sunday, when she saw him alone near the parking lot edge, momentarily separated from his parents who were talking to another family, she made a decision that had no logic, only desperate, distorted need. She called to him by name. She knew his name from church, had heard his mother call to him dozens of times, and told him his mother had sent her to get him, that Linda needed him to come right away, that it was important. Daniel, trusting and trained to obey adults, especially church adults, followed her to her car without hesitation. Tom, who'd been waiting in the driver's seat with the engine running, drove them out of town immediately. They did not stop until they reached Ashford 2 hours later, where they had distant relatives who wouldn't ask too many questions about a sudden child in their lives. They altered Daniel's appearance systematically, cut his hair differently, shorter, and parted on the other side, dyed it a shade darker to change the tone, dressed him in new clothes purchased at a thrift store 2 towns over. They told him his name was Marcus. They enrolled him in school under forged documents in October 1999, claiming they'd moved from out of state and that his birth certificate was delayed due to administrative issues with records transfer. A common enough problem that the school secretary accepted the explanation and enrolled him provisionally pending documentation. In the early days, Daniel had cried, asked for his real parents, said this wasn't right, that he wanted to go home, that his mom and dad would be looking for him. Sandra and Tom told him his parents had given him up, that they didn't want him anymore, that he'd been too much trouble, and they'd sent him away to live with a new family. They told him this was his new family now, that he should be grateful, that if he told anyone the truth, they'd all be separated, and he'd end up in a terrible place, a group home where kids were treated badly. 8-year-old Daniel, confused and terrified, and fundamentally alone, eventually stopped asking. Children adapt to survive. Over time, the memories blurred. He remembered fragments: a house with blue shutters, a dog named Copper who'd sleep at the foot of his bed, red sneakers he'd loved wearing, a bedroom with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that his dad had helped him arrange. But Sandra and Tom dismissed these as dreams or confusion, things he'd seen on TV, imagination running wild, memories from someone else's life. By the time he was 12, Marcus barely thought about those fragments anymore. They felt like scenes from a movie he'd watched long ago. Marcus, Daniel, received the full account in stages over several days, sitting across from Detective Coburn and a trauma counselor named Dr. Ellen Morris, who specialized in cases of parental abduction and identity disruption, a rare specialty but increasingly necessary as cold cases broke open through DNA technology. The word kidnapping felt both accurate and surreal. He'd lived 33 years as Marcus Lane. He had memories of birthday parties with cake and candles, school projects on poster board displayed at science fairs, summer vacations camping in state parks with Sandra and Tom, learning to ride a bike in the driveway, graduating high school in a blue cap and gown. He'd believed he was their son. He'd loved them, or thought he had, or had performed love because that's what children do to survive, to make sense of their world. Now, every memory was reframed, tinged with coercion and lie. The birthday parties were celebrations of a stolen identity. The school projects were built on forged documents. The love was something more complicated than he had words for, something that existed alongside betrayal and theft. In late April 2024, Detective Coburn contacted Linda and Robert Patterson with news he'd been preparing to deliver for days, rehearsing the words to strike the right balance between hope and caution. The conversation was brief and seismic. "We've found your son. He's alive, he's safe. He's 33 years old and living in Ashford." Linda dropped the phone, her hand going slack, the device clattering to the kitchen floor. Robert picked it up, asked Coburn to repeat himself, certain he'd misheard, then sat down hard on the kitchen floor, his back against the cabinet. Coburn repeated the information slowly, giving them time to absorb each detail. Yes, he was certain. DNA match, confirmed by the state lab. Your son is alive. The people who took him have been arrested and charged. He's safe. He knows who he is now, knows what happened. He wants to meet you. They met Daniel, Marcus, 3 weeks later, in a neutral space arranged by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and Dr. Ellen Morris, the family reunification counselor. The location was a quiet conference room in a building that felt institutional but not cold, with soft lighting from lamps rather than overhead fluorescence, comfortable chairs arranged in a loose circle rather than across a table. Linda and Robert arrived early, holding hands so tightly their knuckles whitened, both of them dressed carefully as though for an interview, unsure of the protocol for meeting your son after 25 years. They'd barely slept in the 3 weeks since the call, had spent hours looking at the age progression images, comparing them to the recent photos Detective Coburn had provided via email, trying to reconcile the 8-year-old boy whose face they knew by heart with the 33-year-old man they were about to meet. When Daniel walked in, escorted by Dr. Morris, they both stood automatically. He was taller than Robert by 3 inches, broad-shouldered from years of casual weightlifting, with the same brown eyes Linda saw in the mirror every day, the same slight crook to his nose that Robert had broken in high school playing football. He looked like a stranger. He looked like their son. He looked like both and neither, a paradox that made Linda's throat tighten. No one knew what to say. The counselor guided them gently. Small steps. No pressure, no expectations. Take your time. Linda asked if she could hug him, her voice shaking. Daniel nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak, and she wrapped her arms around him, her body shaking with sobs she'd held back for 25 years. He stood still at first, uncertain, then slowly returned the embrace, his arms coming up around her shoulders. Robert joined them, his arms encircling both of them. They stayed that way for a long moment, three people rebuilding a connection that had been severed for more than half their lives, a connection that felt both immediate, bone-deep recognition and impossibly distant, a bridge spanning a chasm of lost years. Over the following months, the reunification process unfolded in careful increments, guided by Dr. Morris and a team of specialists. Daniel, he'd chosen to reclaim the name, though Marcus still felt more natural on his tongue, still felt like who he was when he looked in the mirror. Visited Willow Ridge on weekends, staying in a hotel at first because the idea of sleeping in his childhood home felt too overwhelming. Linda showed him his old bedroom on his third visit, left mostly unchanged except for the dust that had accumulated despite her occasional cleaning. He touched the books on the shelf, ran his fingers along their spines, pulled out a few to look at the covers. The posters on the wall depicted cartoon characters from the late 90s, faded and curling at the edges. None of it sparked concrete memory, only a vague sense of familiarity, like déjà vu, like looking at a photograph from someone else's childhood. In the closet, Linda pulled out the box of his belongings, the cardboard soft with age. She handed him the red sneakers, her hands trembling. Daniel held them, turning them over in his hands, examining the Velcro straps and the white stripes. They were small, worn, impossibly distant from the man he was now, relics from another lifetime. But something in him cracked open, not a flood of memory, just a quiet recognition, a feeling more than an image, a sense of having been someone different once. "I remember these," he said softly, his voice thick. "I remember running in them. I remember the sound they made on pavement. I remember they lit up when I walked." The legal aftermath was swift and unforgiving. Sandra and Tom Lane were arrested and charged with kidnapping, custodial interference, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. At their arraignment in county court, Sandra wept openly, mascara running down her face, saying she knew it was wrong but couldn't undo it, that she'd loved Marcus, that she'd given him a good life, that she'd tried to be a good mother. Tom sat silent beside her, his face drawn, his hands clenched in his lap, his lawyer entering a plea on his behalf. Both pled guilty as part of a negotiated agreement to avoid trial, their attorneys arguing that a trial would only prolong trauma for all parties. Sandra received 12 years in a federal correctional facility. Tom received 10. Daniel chose not to attend the sentencing, unable to face the people who'd raised him, who'd stolen him, who occupied a space in his heart that had no name. He wrote a victim impact statement instead, a document that took him weeks to draft, going through version after version, trying to articulate something that had no adequate language. In it, he said he didn't know how to reconcile the people who'd raised him with the people who'd stolen his childhood. He said he grieved for the Pattersons, for Linda and Robert who'd lost 25 years, for the life he should have had, for the person he might have been. He said he also grieved for Marcus Lane, the identity he'd worn for 25 years, the person he'd thought he was, now revealed as a construct built on crime. He said he didn't know who he was anymore, that he was learning, that it would take time. The psychological terrain was vast and complex, requiring navigation through territory that had no map. Daniel began therapy twice a week with Dr. Sarah Cheng, a psychologist who specialized in trauma, dissociation, and identity, who'd worked extensively with survivors of long-term abduction and coerced identity cases. They worked through concepts like ambiguous loss, the experience of losing someone who's still alive, or in Daniel's case, losing yourself while still existing. He experienced waves of anger that came without warning, fury at Sandra and Tom for the theft, for the lies, for the years stolen from him and his biological parents. Confusion about which memories were authentic and which were shaped by coercion, which parts of his personality were genuinely his and which had been molded by captors. Guilt that he hadn't somehow known, hadn't sensed the wrongness, hadn't escaped, hadn't found his way back sooner, hadn't saved himself. Dr. Chung reminded him again and again that he'd been a child, that survival wasn't betrayal, that adaptation wasn't complicity, that he'd done what children do, believed what he was told, because the alternative was unbearable. Linda and Robert moved through their own labyrinth of emotion, guided by a therapist who specialized in trauma and loss. Relief that Daniel was alive collided with grief for the decades lost, for the milestones they'd missed. His first day of high school, his graduation, his first job, birthdays and holidays celebrated with people who'd had no right to him. They'd imagined reunion 1,000 times over the years, always with a boy, never with a man who had an entire life they knew nothing about, who'd been shaped by people they'd never met, who carried memories they weren't part of, who'd become someone without them. They attended joint counseling sessions with Daniel once a month, learning to navigate boundaries, learning who each other had become. He wasn't moving back to Willow Ridge. He had a life, a job he liked, friends in Ashford, an apartment he'd just signed a new lease on. But they scheduled regular visits, phone calls every Sunday evening at 7, video chats midweek when schedules allowed. They sent each other photos, Linda's garden in full summer bloom, Robert's workshop projects he completed in the garage, Daniel's new apartment with furniture he'd chosen himself. They learned each other slowly, carefully, building something new from fragments of what had been lost. The story drew significant media attention when it broke in June 2024. News outlets across the region covered the case, framing it as both a miracle and a tragedy, a testament to perseverance and a reminder of the lasting damage of abduction. Legal experts appeared on morning shows discussing the implications of long-term parental abduction and the challenges of reunification when the victim has no clear memory of their original life. Advocacy groups used the case to push for better cross-referencing of missing children databases with DNA registries, arguing that earlier adoption of such technology might have resolved Daniel's case years sooner, might resolve hundreds of others still languishing in cold case files across the country. In the months following the reunion, Daniel made a quiet pilgrimage alone one October afternoon. He returned to the church in Willow Ridge where he'd disappeared, parking in the same lot, walking across pavement that had been repaved multiple times since 1999. The building had been renovated, additions built, the parking lot expanded, but the basic geography remained. He stood at the edge of the lot, near where Sandra had called to him 25 years earlier, and tried to summon the memory. It stayed just out of reach, a shape behind frosted glass, a feeling without image, a sense of before and after without clear boundary between them. He walked through the fellowship hall, now repainted in soft yellows and reconfigured with different furniture, a new coffee station, updated bulletin boards. Linda and Robert met him there for his 4th visit, walking with him through the space, answering his questions about that Sunday, filling in the gaps in the story he was trying to piece together. Daniel asked if they'd ever stopped looking. Robert shook his head firmly. "Not once," he said, his voice steady. Linda added, "You were always here, always in every thought, every decision. Always." Daniel also reached out to a few people who'd been part of Marcus Lane's life. Friends from high school he'd stayed in touch with through social media, a former girlfriend named Amy he'd dated for 2 years in his 20s, a co-worker named Brian who'd become close over the past few years. He explained what had happened in phone calls and coffee shop meetings, that his entire identity had been a lie built by criminals, that everything he'd told them about his childhood was false, that he was someone else. Some reacted with shock and compassion, offering support without hesitation, asking how they could help, what he needed. Others struggled to reconcile the person they'd known with the revelation, their understanding of him fundamentally destabilized, their memories of shared experiences now colored by the knowledge that half the person in those memories had been fiction. A few step back, unable to navigate the cognitive dissonance, unsure how to relate to someone whose entire history had been rewritten. Daniel understood, though it hurt. He was navigating the same dissonance every day, trying to hold two truths simultaneously, that Marcus Lane was real because he'd lived him, and that Marcus Lane was fiction because he'd been stolen. By late 2024, Daniel had begun to find a rhythm in the strange new architecture of his life. He celebrated his 34th birthday twice that year, once on the date Sandra and Tom had always used, July 15th, because those memories and traditions still held meaning even if the foundation was false, and once on his actual birth date, March 12th, with Linda and Robert at a quiet dinner they cooked together at the house on Elmwood Drive. He kept some of Marcus's habits and interests, recognizing they were authentically his, even if the name had been false. His love of science fiction novels, his tendency to organize things by color, his preference for coffee black. He started using Daniel Patterson on legal documents and at work, updating his email signature and business cards, but responded to Marcus from old friends without correction or explanation, understanding that identity wasn't binary, that it could be layered, complicated, capable of holding contradiction. Linda and Robert, for their part, allowed themselves something they hadn't felt in 25 years, a version of peace. It wasn't the life they'd imagined when Daniel was 8, when the future stretched ahead full of school plays and soccer games and college applications. It wasn't the reunion fantasies that had sustained them through the hardest years, the daydreams of Daniel walking through the door unchanged, still 8, still theirs in an uncomplicated way. But it was real. Their son was alive, willing to rebuild connection, fighting to integrate the fractured pieces of his story. That was more than most families in their position ever received. They took what they could get and called it a beginning, learning to measure success in small increments. A Sunday phone call that lasted an hour, a shared meal without awkward silence, a joke that landed, laughter that felt genuine. In early 2025, the Pattersons and Daniel collaborated with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to create a public awareness initiative focused on DNA databases and long-term missing person cases. They recorded video testimonials, spoke at conferences, agreed to carefully vetted media interviews. They spoke about the importance of DNA databases, the need for vigilance even decades after a disappearance, and the reality that resolution doesn't erase trauma. It simply allows new chapters to begin. Daniel emphasized one message in particular during a presentation to law enforcement professionals, that if anyone feels something is wrong with their own origin story, even years later, even decades later, they should ask questions, push for answers. Clerical errors on birth certificates, vague childhood memories that don't align with family narratives, unexplained gaps in documentation, inconsistencies in stories parents tell, these aren't always innocent. Sometimes they're clues. Sometimes they're the thread that unravels a lie decades in the making. The red sneakers found a permanent home in Linda's study, displayed on a shelf alongside a framed photo of 8-year-old Daniel wearing them, standing in the backyard with Copper the dog, and a recent photo of Daniel at 34, standing between his parents in the front yard of the house on Elmwood Drive, all three of them smiling uncertainly but genuinely. They're a tether across time. Evidence of the boy who vanished and the man who returned, proof that objects carry memory even when people can't, a tangible connection between two versions of the same life. Today, Daniel lives his life with dual awareness, carrying both histories. He carries the history of Marcus Lane, the schools he attended, the friendships he formed, the formative moments that shaped him, the person he became under a stolen name, and the emerging understanding of Daniel Patterson, the child stolen and the lineage severed, the life that should have been. He calls Linda and Robert every Sunday at 7 p.m. without fail, a standing appointment that neither side has missed in 8 months. He's building relationships with extended family he never knew existed, aunts and uncles who remembered him as a baby, cousins who'd grown up hearing about the boy who vanished in 1999, grandparents who died waiting for news. They welcome him gently, without expectations or demands, understanding that he's navigating a reunion with an entire lost branch of his own life, learning names and faces and family stories that should have been his inheritance. The case of Daniel Patterson stands as a testament to the stubborn endurance of hope and the strange forms resolution can take. For 25 years, Linda and Robert Patterson lived in the unbearable space between certainty and possibility, certain something terrible had happened, but unable to relinquish the possibility that their son was alive somewhere, that the story wasn't over. In 2024, that possibility became fact, but the fact was far stranger than any scenario they'd imagined. Their son had been hidden in plain sight, living 200 miles away, raised under a stolen identity by the people who'd taken him from a church parking lot on a Sunday morning when the air smelled like honeysuckle and the sun caught his red sneakers. The criminal justice process concluded with Sandra and Tom Lane imprisoned, but justice, in the emotional sense, remains a work in progress, something that may never feel complete. Daniel continues therapy, continues the slow integration of 2 lifetimes, continues the work of figuring out who he is when both names are true and false simultaneously. The Pattersons continue to learn who their son became in the years they lost, continue to mourn what was taken while celebrating what was found. It's not a neat story. There's no triumphant music, no moment when everything suddenly makes sense and all the pieces fall into place. There are only incremental steps forward and occasional steps back, difficult conversations about painful topics, shared meals where silence sometimes feels more comfortable than words, tentative laughter that gradually becomes easier, and the quiet insistence that connection is still possible even when the path forward is unrecognizable. If Daniel's story offers anything beyond its own particular anguish and unlikely resolution, it's this: disappearance doesn't have to be permanent. Truth can surface decades late, and healing is a long, imperfect journey. For families still searching, still waiting for a knock at the door or a phone call that changes everything, Daniel Patterson's return shows that sometimes, against all reason, the lost do come home. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the DNA DOE project continue to advance the technologies and methods that make such reunifications possible. The lessons learned from Daniel's case have inspired protocol changes for law enforcement agencies across the country, encouraging more agencies to revisit cold cases, utilize expanded DNA matching, and provide trauma-informed reunification services for families caught between hope and finality. There are now new guidelines on maintaining missing persons files, ensuring data is never lost or neglected, and on sharing data across states to prevent children from falling through bureaucratic cracks. Linda and Robert, in partnership with these organizations, help educate the public and encourage vigilance. A simple document anomaly or childhood memory might be the first clue to a long, untold story. Daniel remains active in therapy, steadily working toward reconciling the 2 identities within himself. His journey of integration, balancing his life as Marcus with his rediscovered roots as Daniel, continues to unfold. He has testified before congressional committees seeking to improve national databases and support services for adult reunifications, sharing his lived experience with candor and courage. Though he knows there are holes in his story that may never be filled, he finds meaning in using his voice to help others like him. The family's journey is far from over. Linda and Robert savor the routines they once thought forever lost, Sunday calls, shared holidays, even quiet evenings spent together in the backyard under the maples. Daniel's red sneakers, now faded by time, remain on display in Linda's study, a symbol of hope kept alive and questions finally answered. The Pattersons cherish every ordinary moment, knowing that normalcy, once shattered, can be rebuilt, imperfectly, incrementally, together. If Daniel's return has taught those who followed his story anything, it's that hope is tenacious, and the bonds of family are stronger than years of uncertainty. For all families with a Daniel of their own still lost in the world, never give up. Where there is even a sliver of hope, a door to the future may swing open, quietly, unexpectedly, but sometimes just in time.